Hello, this is the fifth of the series of Link podcasts that looks at the middle years of the Weimar Republic, the so-called Golden Era, in which the Nazi Party was not on the surface doing well. And this final podcast, which will actually be broken down into two parts, so sort of two sub-podcasts, so to speak, looks at the end of the Golden Era, the year 1929, in which the crisis began. We as historians can now see very clearly, because we have the advantage of what we call hindsight. We can look back and we know what happened subsequently, and we can now see why 1929 marked the end of the Golden Era and the beginning of a huge period of crisis for Germany. So, why was it a crisis? Starting off with a simple image, it's quite a poignant image in several ways. It's a funeral, and it's the 16th of October 1929. You can actually see that in the date at the bottom there, in 1929. Just pulling back. It's the funeral of Gustav Stresemann, probably the only great politician that the Weimar Republic produced. He died at the age of 51 on the 3rd of October 1929, and this is a picture in the centre of Berlin. It was a huge, he was given effectively a state funeral, not the sort of funeral that you would normally give to just the head of government, but he had made such a significant contribution to Germany's recovery in the 5 years before his death that it was recognised at the time that this was a tragic loss for Germany. Looking at that picture, the second reason it is really quite poignant and quite moving is you can't help but think all those people in that picture have no idea what is lying ahead of them, because just 2 weeks later the Great Crisis began, and the crisis that began on the 29th of October 1929, 13 days after this photograph, was relentless, and it continued for the next 16 years. Not until May 1945 was the grip on Germany relinquished, and even then it continued for many years after that, depending on which half of Germany you lived in, but that's a different story. So what exactly was this crisis? Okay, so in a sense it began with the death of Stresemann, because he was the one statesman who possibly could have steered Germany through those difficult years, but losing him, Germany lost a leader who could possibly have prevented Adolf Hitler taking power. That's what happened 2 weeks later. The Wall Street crash happened thousands of miles away on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. We'll come on to that one in a minute. But that event opened the way for the rise to power of Hitler. He didn't actually take power until the 30th of January 1933. At the time, when Hitler did take power, German people did not see it as a bad thing. Again, we as historians can see the terrible events that then unrolled with Hitler becoming Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933. Germany entered a period of dictatorship, loss of freedom, loss of human rights, in which terror ruled the streets. That's a picture of the dreaded SS, the black shirts, Hitler's policemen. And of course, 6 years later, on the 1st of September 1939, Hitler took Germany into the Second World War, when Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939. Again, at the time, German people did not see that as a bad thing. Many of them supported it, particularly because the war went well in the first 2 years. But from 1941 onwards, the war really turned against Germany, and ultimately, by May 1945, Germany was in complete ruins. Unlike World War One, where Germany was defeated, but in World War One, remember, no foreign soldier set foot on German soil. Germany surrendered before she was occupied. Very different with World War Two. Hitler did not surrender, so Germany was occupied from two directions: the British and the French, or the British and the Americans, sorry, from the west, and from the east, the Soviet Union. And that's a picture of a Soviet soldier, a very famous photograph of a Russian soldier from the Soviet Union, hoisting the Soviet flag over the bombed out Reichstag building in the centre of Berlin. That's May 1945. So let's go back then to the beginning of the crisis. What exactly was the crisis? What caused this crisis? Well, it really began, again, we as historians with hindsight can see that it started in October 1929 with what we call the Wall Street crash. Basically, that's the name given to the huge fall in American share prices in October 1929. As you know, the Dawes Plan had underpinned the recovery of, so that should say the German economy, just cross that out and remember it should say the German economy had been dependent on loans from the USA. I used the image of a house of cards in one of the earlier podcasts, which I think really does capture it. Germany appeared on the surface to be strong by 1928-29, but the recovery was completely propped up by foreign money. So when in October 1929 the Wall Street crash happened, the American stock market collapsed, American banks were short of money, so they desperately recalled all of their loans. Now, they had loaned money to other countries, not just to Germany, but Germany, more than any other country, as the country that needed the money most in the 1920s, had borrowed from American banks more than any other country. So although the Wall Street crash had a knock-on effect and impacted on lots of countries, Britain included, it in particular hit Germany because Germany had borrowed so much money from America. So the Wall Street crash is the single event. It happened on one day, the 29th of October 1929. It triggered an event that lasted for 6 or 7 years, and that event is called the Great Depression. It lasted until the mid-1930s. It's difficult to put an exact date when the Great Depression ended, but somewhere in the mid-1930s it began to tail off and things began to improve. So what was the Great Depression? Let's just go through the key points. It was a worldwide economic slump. Okay, it impacted on the whole of the world. It was triggered by the Wall Street crash. That's a good word to use in your answer, triggered. Okay. The outward signs of the Great Depression was the closure of lots and lots of businesses. Okay, remember, businesses, many of them had borrowed money. That money now disappeared because America pulled it back. And so the key feature of the Great Depression was unemployment. As businesses closed, people lost their jobs. So by 1932, half of all Germans aged 16 to 30 were unemployed, and by the end of 1932 it was just over 6 million people unemployed. Can't really overestimate how cataclysmic that was. Now, a quick word of caution here. Don't confuse the Great Depression with what happened in 1923. Now, remember, we've looked at the year 1923, 6 years earlier, and the main problem that hit Germany then was hyperinflation. Hyperinflation was prices rising. Jump into 1929, the Great Depression. the Great Depression was not about rising prices. Actually, think about this, it's called the depression. When you have a depression, prices fall. So the problem was not about rising prices. So whatever you do in the exam, do not say that prices were going up. Do not say there was inflation, because there wasn't. The key issue in the Great Depression was unemployment, people losing their jobs. Okay. Next point, many of those people who were unemployed were working classes, and what they did is they now rejected the Republic. Okay, effectively they lost faith in the system, and they turned to the extreme left, and by supporting the Communist Party. So the Communist Party gained votes as a result of the Great Depression. Now, with the Communist Party gaining votes, there developed a fear amongst the middle classes, the people with property and wealth, a huge fear of communism. Their big fear was that the communists might take control of government. If the communists had taken control of government, then effectively that would have opened the way to the middle classes losing their wealth and losing their property. Because remember what communism is. Communism is about taking from the rich and redistributing wealth to the lower classes. So because of that fear of communism, many of the middle classes now also lost faith in the Republic. But instead of turning to the extreme left, they turned to the opposite extreme, to the extreme right, and in particular to the Nazi Party, who seemed to be a party that seemed to be capable of protecting their wealth and their property against the rise of communism. So that movement of the vote, away from the moderate centre, so it's away from the centre, the parties who support the Republic, with the working classes going to the extreme left and the middle classes going to the extreme right, is what we call polarisation, a good word to use in your answer. Okay, think about the North Pole and the South Pole. Okay, on the planet Earth, they're at the opposite ends. That's where the word comes from, the word polarisation. So that's the end of this first podcast on the crisis year of 1929. Go straight to part two. This podcast has looked at the economic and social consequences of the Wall Street crash. The next podcast will look at the political consequences of the Wall Street crash. Thank you.